So public relations often gets a bad rap because of its tendency to manipulate and its disregard for morality. But public relations is fascinating, and in this video you'll be shown just how the profession's godfather came to be. Now the story about here is based on truth. I've read copiously on this man, and I've written a story that is very much based on the facts. The story is a World Order Red label, which means unlike my black labels, there is no science fiction, no action adventure, and no fantasy. This is a straight up retelling of the facts. There are a few areas where I've dramatized things for the dramatic effect, but everything you see is based on the source material. Without further ado, let's dive into it. World Order proudly presents the dark history of public relations. So the story begins with a young Edward Bernays working on a farm in Ithaca, New York, and he's really hating it. You know, he's 16 years old and he really doesn't like being there. You know, he's only there because his dad told him to be there. You know, his dad is swept up by the whole Teddy Roosevelt phenomenon where practically every American wanted their son to be a farmer. And he's over there and he hates it so much that he meets up with his friend in New York. And he tells him how he's having to milk cows, clean stalls, and analyze soil. And his friend suddenly goes, "Well, why don't you come work for me?" So his friend was helping his dad publish articles in a couple of medical journals, and they needed a writer to come on. And Eddie's like, "Oh jeez, well, you know, I don't know, my dad's invested so much in me, you know, he sent me to farm school and whatnot, and I really just don't know if I can go through with this." But then his friend convinces him, and so Eddie goes back home and tells his father about the radical new opportunity in New York, and his dad isn't crazy about it. You know, his dad's like, you know, you got a background in agriculture, what have you got to offer to medicine? But he loves his son, and you know, after a while he gives in, and Eddie eventually goes and he starts writing articles for $50 a week, which even back then really isn't very much at all. And the first few months he really struggles, so he doesn't really know what he's doing. He has the right kind of spirit, you know, he has the right kind of entrepreneurial mindset, but he doesn't know what he's doing. And a couple months in, it starts getting really difficult. He has a couple of good articles on taking baths and the dangers of wearing corsets, but things become really difficult when he has to address this STD problem. Now, at the time, New York is swept up in a sexually transmitted disease epidemic. Hey sexy! The problem is spreading like wildfire, and yet no one wants to talk about it because of the Victorian norms inhibiting free speech. Eddie makes his mission to get the word out about this, and this really gives him a reason to keep going on. "I'm telling you, Freddie, we can make it happen. Me and you, come on, we're a team." "Forget it, Eddie. Your article was turned down by over 137,000 physicians." Again, I'm not making this up. No one wants to accept this guy's journals, and no one wants to break the taboo. Come the end of February 1913, Eddie's on his last bit of income, and he's really starting to run out. And it's as he's starting to run out that he hears about this guy called Richard Bennett. Now, Richard Bennett is a playwright, and he's written a story called Damaged Goods. And Eddie gets involved, and he asks what's the play about. And it turns out it's about this syphilitic man who, as a result of his ignorance, starts spreading syphilis to every frickin' person he meets. And Eddie's like, "Oh, you know, this is perfect. You know, if this play takes off, we can really overcome this norm and save society." And Bennett says, "Well, you know, that's nice and all, but how are you actually going to help me? What, you make like $50 a week? You don't know anyone? What are you, like 21, 22? What are you gonna do?" And Eddie is pretty much up to his neck at this point. You know, he's got his hands tied. He's tired of taking stick from people, and he knows he needs to be quick. You know, he knows he needs to get something done, or else he's gonna have to go back to that freaking farm. So he goes and he calls the one person he knows, and it's this guy who works for the social reform and public health community. And it just so turns out that this guy just so happens to know J.D Rockefeller Jr, who just so happens to be looking for some philanthropic project. Now, for those that don't know, J.D. Rockefeller Jr. was the son of J.D. Rockefeller and had been going through some messes of his own in recent years. He'd had issues with strikes and needed a PR stunt to reform his image. He takes a liking to Eddie, he likes the idea, he thinks it can be great. You know, there's even a quote from him saying how, you know, "We need to address these sexual mores, otherwise society will pay." And he starts getting all his friends involved, yeah, so within a matter of weeks, checks start pouring in, not only from Rockefeller, but from Vanderbilt, from the Roosevelts. You know, Eddie gets a pretty good crowd on board, and yeah, things start to really take off. And you know, they stage the play, And it's a triumph, you know, the crowd love it. It's shown in the Washington theaters to Supreme Court justices and members of Congress. And Eddie's success lands him a job on Broadway, where he spends several years hobnobbing with famous actors and actresses and really living it up. And it's only when the First World War happens that this world that he's starting to get accustomed to suddenly turns upside down. So come 1917, everyone leaves. The war becomes the priority, everyone signs up, either as a soldier or whatever, doing their part in whatever way they can. Eddie originally tries signing up as a soldier, but he can't. They draw her attention to his poor eyesight and his flat feet, and they deem him physically unsuitable. So Eddie instead enlists in the Committee on Public Information, which is this organization that rallies support behind the effort. For those that don't know, the Committee on Public Information was all about disseminating propaganda and psychological warfare. Okay, it was about boosting morale, convincing Americans to support the war, convincing them that the enemy was evil, and so on. It's during this time that he starts playing around with all the techniques he'd later use in his campaigns. You know, he starts trumpeting the war on the grounds that it's a fight for freedom and democracy and all these words that resonate with Americans. Now, this was a far cry from the real motives at play. And as a result, Eddie starts waking up to just how powerful a medium he's working with, you know, whereas before with the magazines he was challenging outdated norms. Eddie's now convincing the masses to support an international war for a supposed greater good. And for Eddie, this is insane. You know, his enthusiasm skyrockets shortly after the war ends when he convinces the US government to support a Latvian resistance movement against some people called the Bolsheviks. And it's around this time that Eddie notes that, wow, you know, ideas are weapons and words are bullets, you know. He's starting to come to all these revelations about what communication is and what effective communication can do. You're not just changing opinion, you're shaping people, you're shaping who they are. And he's like, wow, this public relations thing is incredible. And so he leaves the committee and he starts his own company in downtown New York. You know, he grows a mustache, he begins building a team, one of them being his future wife. You know, he's so impressed by her. He says her judgment is even better than his. And, you know, they get to work, they get married. He releases a book in 1923 called Crystallising Public Opinion, which sets the precedent for all PR hereafter. And he makes the commitment that, yes, you know, I'm influencing people, and yes, you know, I'm shaping them, but I'm also guiding them towards better outcomes, you know. He genuinely believed in the elite's ability to steer society for the better. You know, this is a generation that's coming off the back of the war to end all wars. It's during this time that Eddie starts living it up, during the roaring 20s, you know, with the money he's making from printing the works of his uncle Sigmund Freud in America. And yes, you heard me right, Edward Bernays is Sigmund Freud's nephew. I can't believe it's taken me this long to actually mention that. But yes, again, Eddie Bernays was Sigmund Freud's nephew. I think it's a big part of why he became so influential. He was very well read from early on. I think Freud's works played a huge part in shaping him. Eddie was exposed very early on to things like mass psychology and social psychology, and you know, he was being exposed to these things before they broke into the mainstream. You know, Eddie once said that if you want to be a great PR man, you have to have an understanding of practically everything: English, history, economics, sociology, psychology, and so on. He publishes the works and he makes a big splash on the Roaring Twenties, an era in which public relations and in fact all industry is taking off in America. You know, before 1917 there were some 18 books on public relations. Then between 1917 and 1925 this number skyrockets to 28. This is a booming time, not just for PR but for everyone. For those that don't know, go check out some of the gangster stories from this time, man. This is the age of Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, who was the other one? Arnold Rothstein. There's so many great gangster stories, man. If you haven't already, go check out Boardwalk Empire, where they are all in Boardwalk Empire, man. Seasons 1 to 3, man. Seasons 1 to 3 of Boardwalk Empire is so good. I mean, these people are evil people, but they all have such fascinating stories. Oh, man, I'd love to do a gangster epic one day. Genuinely, it's coming, guys. You know it's coming. Right, anyway, back to the story. So you get a lot of people who are getting rich during this time, and as a result, you get more people investing in things like PR and questioning what it can do for their business. And no person is more drawn to this enterprise than a guy called George Washington Hill, who runs a cigarette company called Lucky Strike. Is that him? Yeah, that's him, all right. Perfect. I'm telling you, Walter. If I can crack the female market, it'd be like opening a new gold mine right in our front yard. Hey, sport, you Eddie Bernays? Yeah, who's asking? My name is George Washington Hill. I run Lucky Strike Cigarettes, and I need an ad man to come on. Technically, sir, I'm a PR man. Hey, tomato, right? Meet me in my office, and bring a notepad. Now, I don't want you to have any illusions. Lucky Strike is doing very well. Our numbers have skyrocketed since the First World War, when the government helped us pack cigarettes into the men's rations. It's women who concern me, Eddie. Our product still seems to be taboo with them. And that's where you come in. Eddie, I'm gonna give you $25,000 to crack the female market. Eddie being Eddie doesn't even blink, you know. Like, give me hotels, events, galleries, you know. I want every venue encouraging women to reach for a cigarette instead of a sweet. Why, as an alternative to sweets, Eddie, slenderness and thinness are coming into vogue, Jerry. If we can attach our product to an idea, then we'll be unstoppable. Alright, so Eddie goes up to all these medical officers and starts getting them to talk about the slimming effects of cigarettes on their in their journals. He starts changing the very world people live in. I mean, this is a guy who's really starting to come into form during the late 20s, you know. Kitchen cabinet makers are instructed to provide special spaces for people to hold their cigarettes in. Container makers are asked to provide labeled tins for smokers, just as they did for tea and coffee. Eddie goes up to newspaper men and gets them to print cartoons of people who, you know, are 1 minute they're overweight and the next they're totally vanishing after having a cigarette. It's a very successful campaign, and, you know, to top it all off, he gets women to march down 48th and 54th Street and they light their cigarettes in public during a parade, which is huge, and it's a massive stunt to associate cigarettes with the feminist movement, and it totally works. Within days, women begin smoking in public areas. The move is a phenomenal success, and it's as Eddie starts getting the type of praise he's always dreamt of. It's as he begins partying with the elites in high society New York, in the wealthy flats of, you know, Fifth Avenue and so on, that he crosses a path from which he'll never return. Dylan, have you seen this? No, what is it? The reports. We found that cigarettes not only cause nausea, but vomit, diarrhea, blood pressure, and cancer. I don't want to hear about it. But Eddie, I said I don't want to hear about it. Our product might not work wonders for people's health, but neither do sweets, sex, weapons. Why is it okay to sell those things? Why can't we sell this? Mr. Bernays, Washington Hill is asking to see you. George, I really can't. Sit down, Eddie. I need to speak to you. What is it, George? It's about the packaging. The surveys are in. People don't like it. Can't we just change the packaging and lose millions on reinventing the brand? Come on, Eddie. You gotta give me something better than that. Geez, George, I don't know what you want me to do. Wave a magic wand and have everyone suddenly fall in love with the color green? And this is exactly what Eddie does. He throws a green ball where he invites loads of socialites and celebrities to it in the hope that the newspapers get the story out and start going on about this green ball. Everything at this ball is green, by the way. The dresses people are wearing, the food people are eating, the lighting. Eddie gets a psychologist to come in and give a talk on the benefits of green. But the move totally backfires. He goes into the office and Washington Hill gives him a report of how the ball hasn't changed anything. And, you know, Eddie, you know, eventually leaves Lucky Strike and he goes to work for United Fruit, where he maybe even considers changing his ways for a bit. You know, he tries to get Lucky Strike to be a little bit more compassionate with their clients. But this ultimately fails and backfires, and Eddie's very much caught up by the trend of the day, which is anti-communism. This is starting to really take off in the late 40s and 50s. And Eddie, who by this point is more committed to money and materialism than anything else, totally jumps on the anti-communist bandwagon and begins echoing the concerns of America's East Coast elite, rather than extending an arm to maybe the less fortunate people of the developed world. He becomes an agent of imperialism rather than a champion of the underdog. At the time, this company called United Fruit had owned a lot of land in Guatemala, and I think a lot of Guatemalan people felt like they were being priced out of the market like unfairly. Like there was like 70% of those people were illiterate, 70% were in poverty. They believed that they could do with some land redistribution, basically, which was okay, a socialist policy, but there's also the case to be made that it was needed for them at the time. And the United Fruit Company didn't want anything to do with this. They didn't want anything. They saw their private property being threatened, and they used Eddie to run a campaign, and eventually brought the CIA on to topple the legitimately appointed Guatemalan government and replace it with an American-backed dictator. And this ended up causing, the tragic thing is lots of people died over the next 20-30 years. Lots of people died as a result of this move. And Eddie kind of becomes complicit in this near enough in this mass murder, basically. I mean, it shows how someone ends up becoming an agent of imperialism, really, this story. Guys, many thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you're new here, do make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. World Order covers all things geopolitics. I take a lot of great figures and retell their stories. I've got a few really big stories coming out. One on Henry Kissinger, one on Richard Nixon, and one on the origins of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And these ones are like action-adventure style stories. Like, I've taken the original history, it's all based on the original history, but I've retold it in an action-adventure sci-fi fantasy like way, and it'll be part of a separate playlist. So obviously, if you're more into the non-fiction stuff, if you're more into the dramatization without the fantasy and stuff, then stick with this playlist. But if you're looking for something a bit more new and original, and I hope inspiring, then do check out that playlist as well, because that's the one I'm really putting all my energies into. This one's nice, but that's really what I live for. And yeah, it's like, hit the bell icon as well, because I'll be releasing way more videos for that series. I want to do an entire series on the Cold War, where I take the Cold War but reproduce it as like a action-adventure type of series. And also I do the World Order show, which are more like explainer-like videos, where I just discuss geopolitical concepts and ideas and questions. So guys, I've got a lot to offer on this channel, so do hit the bell icon, do hit the like button, do hit subscribe, and yeah, I'll see you all in the next video. Take care, bye bye.